The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Annie Chen sat in her car outside Bayview Veterinary Clinic, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The clock on her dashboard read 8:47 a.m., but time seemed to have slowed to a crawl. In the backseat, her beloved 12-year-old golden retriever, Buddy, lay quietly on his favorite blue blanket, his breathing labored but steady. Annie caught glimpses of him in her rearview mirror, remembering the energetic puppy who had bounded into her life all those years ago. Back then, she had just started her first job out of college, living alone in a tiny apartment and feeling overwhelmed by the world. Buddy had been an impulse decision, the last puppy at a local shelter with eyes that seemed to look straight into her soul. The memories flooded back as she sat there. Buddy destroying her favorite shoes, but looking so apologetic she couldn't stay mad. Him waiting patiently by the door every evening for her return from work, the way he had stayed by her side, head in her lap, during that terrible week when she had lost her dad. Through every up and down, every celebration and heartbreak, Buddy had been her constant companion. But the past few weeks had been different. It started with Buddy taking longer to get up in the mornings. At first, Annie had attributed it to age. After all, 12 years was getting up there for a large dog. Then he began refusing his favorite treats, the special duck-flavored ones she would buy from the pet boutique downtown. His morning walks became shorter and shorter until they were just brief trips to the garden and back. The worst part was watching the light fade from his eyes. Buddy, who used to chase squirrels and play fetch until Annie's arm got tired, now spent most of his days lying in his bed by the window. He would still wag his tail when she came home, but even that seemed to take tremendous effort. She had tried everything. Different foods, joint supplements, acupuncture, even those expensive therapeutic massage sessions that her friend had recommended. The first vet had suggested pain medications, which helped for a while. But when Buddy stopped eating altogether 3 days ago, Annie knew in her heart that something was seriously wrong. The second opinion from Dr. Lee at Bayview had confirmed her fears. The blood work showed several concerning values, and the X-rays revealed what looked like masses in his abdomen. Dr. Lee had gently explained the options, but they all seemed to lead down the same painful path. A tap on her window startled Annie from her thoughts. Mrs. Rodriguez, the clinic's receptionist who had known Buddy since he was a puppy, stood there with concern written across her face. Annie quickly wiped her eyes, realizing she had been sitting in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes. "Take all the time you need, honey," Mrs. Rodriguez said softly when Annie rolled down her window. "There's no rush. Would you like some water? Or maybe some coffee?" Annie shook her head, managing a weak smile. "Thanks, but I think we're ready." Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the fact that she wasn't ready at all. How could anyone ever be ready for this? She turned to look at Buddy again. Despite his weakness, he lifted his head slightly and gave her that look, the one that had made her fall in love with him at the shelter all those years ago. His brown eyes, though clouded with age, still held such depth, such understanding. Annie took a deep breath and reached for her phone, scrolling through the hundreds of photos she had of Buddy. There he was at the beach last summer, proudly carrying a piece of driftwood twice his size. Another showed him wearing the ridiculous reindeer antlers at Christmas, patiently posing for her annual holiday card. The most recent one was from just 2 months ago, Buddy sitting in his favorite spot in the garden, surrounded by blooming flowers. The sound of another car pulling into the lot forced Annie back to the present moment. She couldn't stay here forever, trapped between memories of the past and fear of the future. With trembling fingers, she unclipped her seatbelt and opened her door. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of newly cut grass and early autumn. Moving to the back door, Annie gently called Buddy's name. He responded with a slight tail wag, but made no attempt to get up. Careful not to cause him any pain, she slipped her arms under his body, thankful that she had been practicing this lift for the past week. Buddy had lost so much weight that carrying him was easier than it should have been, another reminder of why they were here. As she helped him out of the car, Buddy's paw caught on the blanket, pulling it with him. Annie didn't bother trying to detach it. The blanket had been his comfort through so many vet visits. It seemed right that he should have it now. Together, they stood in the parking lot, Annie supporting most of his weight, while Buddy took in the surroundings with his nose slightly lifted to the breeze. A young woman walking her energetic puppy passed by, the puppy straining at its leash to get closer. The woman quickly steered her dog away, catching sight of Annie's tear-stained face and seeming to understand the gravity of the moment. She gave Annie a compassionate nod before hurrying past. The clinic's automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, releasing a blast of air-conditioned air scented with antiseptic. Annie had always hated that smell, but today it seemed particularly cruel, so sterile, so final. Buddy's nails clicked softly on the tile floor as they made their way inside, each step measured and careful. Mrs. Rodriguez had already prepared their paperwork, sparing Annie the need to handle any administrative tasks. The waiting room was intentionally empty. The clinic always scheduled these appointments during quiet periods. The only sound was the gentle bubbling of the tropical fish tank in the corner, the same tank that Buddy used to watch with fascination during his younger, healthier visits. The morning sunlight filtered through the maple trees surrounding Bayview Veterinary Clinic, creating dancing patterns on the sidewalk. Annie gently guided Buddy toward the clinic's small garden, a peaceful space designed specifically for moments like these. Her heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice as she watched him take each careful step, his movements so different from the joyful bounds that had once characterized their walks together. The garden path curved through beds of colorful flowers, many of them still blooming despite the approaching autumn. Buddy's nose twitched slightly at the familiar scents. He had visited this garden during every vet appointment over the years, always eager to investigate every plant and corner. Today, though, his investigation was much slower, more deliberate. They paused near a wooden bench, where Annie had often sat during Buddy's routine checkups, usually watching him charm every person who passed by. The old boy had always been a natural diplomat, making friends wherever he went. Even now, despite his weakness, there was still that gentle dignity about him, that inherent goodness that had made everyone fall in love with him over the years. Annie remembered the day Buddy had helped a frightened child overcome their fear of dogs right here in this garden. The little one had been terrified after a scary encounter with a neighbor's pet, but Buddy had somehow known exactly what to do. He had simply laid down, his head on his paws, and waited patiently until the child felt brave enough to reach out and touch his soft fur. By the end of that visit, the child was giggling and giving Buddy gentle pats, while their grateful mother took photos. "Remember that sweet boy?" Annie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You've always known exactly how to help." She knelt beside him, not caring about the morning dew soaking through her jeans. Buddy leaned against her leg, seeking the comfort of her touch as he had done thousands of times before. A gentle breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the sweet scent of late-blooming roses. Annie noticed how Buddy lifted his nose slightly, taking in the familiar smells one last time. His tail gave the faintest wag as a butterfly fluttered past, landing briefly on a nearby purple coneflower. Even now, he found joy in the simple beauties of life. They moved slowly along the path, stopping every few steps to let Buddy rest. Annie didn't rush him. These moments were precious beyond measure. She took mental photographs of everything. The way his ears still perked up slightly at the sound of birds chirping in the trees, how his graying muzzle looked against the colorful flower beds, the gentle rhythm of his breathing as he leaned against her for support. Near the garden's small pond, a family of ducks paddled peacefully, completely undisturbed by their presence. Time seemed to stand still as Buddy watched them, perhaps remembering his younger days when he would get excitedly bark at any waterfowl he spotted during their walks in the park. Now he observed them with quiet interest, his tired eyes following their movements across the water. Annie found herself talking softly to him, reminiscing about their countless adventures together. "Remember that time you decided to jump into the lake after my hat? You were so proud of yourself when you brought it back, even though it was completely ruined." She smiled through her tears. "Or that camping trip when you somehow managed to get into our neighbor's tent and ate all their hot dogs. You looked so guilty but so satisfied at the same time." Each memory brought both joy and pain. Joy for the wonderful life they had shared, and pain knowing these moments were coming to an end. Annie pulled out her phone and started taking pictures, wanting to capture these final moments together. Buddy, sensing her emotional state as he always had, pressed closer against her leg, offering comfort even now. A young couple walking past with their elderly retriever caught Annie's eye. They seemed to understand immediately what was happening. Perhaps they had been through this before, or maybe they could simply read the situation in Annie's tear-stained face and Buddy's slow, careful movements. The woman gave Annie a compassionate smile, while their dog gently wagged its tail at Buddy in a show of quiet solidarity. As they continued their slow journey around the garden, Annie noticed how the morning light caught Buddy's fur, making it glow like spun gold in places. Despite his age and illness, he was still beautiful to her. His face might be white now, his steps might be slower, but he was still the same loving soul who had shared her life for 12 wonderful years. They paused by a patch of soft grass where Buddy had often rolled happily during previous visits. Today, he carefully lowered himself down, seeming to want to feel the cool grass against his fur one more time. Annie sat beside him, gently running her fingers through his coat. She found all his favorite spots, behind his ears, under his chin, that special place on his chest that always made his back leg twitch slightly. A small brown sparrow hopped closer, pecking at the ground near them. In his younger days, Buddy would have been fascinated by the bird, wanting to chase it or at least watch it intently. Now he simply observed it with gentle interest, his head resting on Annie's lap. The morning sun had risen higher, warming them both as they sat there together, sharing these precious final moments. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared quietly at the garden entrance, her kind face full of understanding. She didn't rush them, simply stood waiting patiently until Annie gave a small nod. It was time. Annie helped Buddy to his feet, supporting his weight as they made their way toward the clinic's back entrance, a special door used for these particular appointments, away from the main waiting room. As they walked those final steps, Annie felt Buddy's warm presence against her leg, his fur soft under her supporting hands, his trust in her complete and unwavering as it had always been. The garden's peaceful atmosphere embraced them one last time, a gentle breeze carrying the sweet scent of flowers around them, nature's own goodbye to a faithful friend. The clinic's waiting room felt different today, usually bustling with life. Excited puppies pulling at their leashes, cats mewing in their carriers, children leafing through old magazines. It now stood empty and quiet. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the soft bubbling of the tropical fish tank in the corner. Mrs. Rodriguez had cleared the schedule for this moment, a kindness that Annie appreciated more than words could express. Buddy's favorite blue blanket dragged slightly on the floor as they made their way to the reception desk. He had always loved that blanket from the very first day she brought him home. It still had a small hole in one corner from when he was a teething puppy, determined to make everything his own. Now it provided comfort to them, both as they faced this final journey together. The familiar scent of antiseptic hung in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee from the staff room. Annie's hands trembled as she reached for the clipboard Mrs. Rodriguez held out. The form seemed both mundane and surreal. How could something as extraordinary as saying goodbye to your best friend be reduced to checkboxes and signature lines? Dr. Chen, who had been Buddy's vet for the past decade, emerged from his office. His kind face showed the weight of what was to come, but also the compassion of someone who truly understood the bond between humans and their animal companions. He had been there for every milestone: Buddy's vaccinations, the time he ate an entire chocolate cake, resulting in a terrifying emergency visit, the first signs of arthritis in his later years. "Take your time with the paperwork," he said softly, his voice carrying years of experience with moments like these. "Would you like some water? Or perhaps some tea?" Annie shook her head, trying to focus on the forms in front of her. Each question seemed to blur before her eyes. Date of birth. She remembered bringing home that tiny golden ball of fluff, no idea how completely he would change her life. Medical history. Flashes of worry and relief over the years, each incident making their bond stronger. Current medications. The growing collection of pills and supplements that had helped keep him comfortable these past few months. Buddy leaned heavily against her leg as she wrote, his presence both a comfort and a reminder of why they were here. His breathing was labored but steady, each breath a small battle against the illness that had slowly taken over his body. Annie found herself matching her breathing to his, as she had done so many times during thunderstorms when he needed calming. The wall clock ticked softly, marking time in its relentless way. Annie glanced at the collection of photos displayed near the reception desk. Happy, healthy pets who had been treated at the clinic over the years. Among them was a picture from 3 years ago, Buddy wearing a party hat at the clinic's anniversary celebration, his mouth open in what looked like a laugh as he tried to catch treats thrown by the staff. Mrs. Rodriguez quietly placed a box of tissues on the counter without comment, her years of experience telling her exactly what was needed. Through her tears, Annie could see the older woman's own eyes glistening. Buddy had that effect on people, making them feel like family rather than just clients. The sound of a door opening somewhere in the clinic made Buddy's ears twitch slightly. Even now, his natural curiosity showed through. A young veterinary assistant peeked out, her face softening at the sight of them. She had always snuck Buddy extra treats during his visits, claiming he was her favorite patient. Today, she quickly wiped her eyes and disappeared back into the treatment area, giving them privacy. Annie's hand paused over the final signature line. The weight of it felt impossible. How could she sign something that would end 12 years of unconditional love? But then Buddy looked up at her with those trusting brown eyes, and she knew. This wasn't about ending love, it was about honoring it. About making the hardest choice because it was the right one for him. Dr. Chen had stepped away, giving them space, but now he returned with quiet footsteps. "The room is ready whenever you are," he said gently. "We can use the side entrance, it's more private." Annie nodded, unable to speak. She had chosen this clinic all those years ago because someone had recommended Dr. Chen's exceptional care and compassion. Now, facing the most difficult moment of their journey together, she was grateful for that choice. Mrs. Rodriguez came around the desk, bending down to give Buddy one last gentle pat. "You've been the best boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Then she straightened up, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Take as long as you need in there. We're in no hurry." The morning sun had found its way through the clinic's windows, creating warm patches on the floor. Buddy had always loved to lie in sunbeams, and even now, he paused briefly in one, letting the warmth soak into his tired bones. Annie stood with him, memorizing every detail, how the light turned his fur to gold, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, the way his tail still managed a tiny wag when she scratched his favorite spot behind his ears. Together, they made their way toward the examination room, each step measured and careful. The hallway seemed longer than usual, its familiar pictures and educational posters blurring in Annie's tear-filled vision. Buddy stayed close to her, as he had done throughout their life together, trusting her to guide him on this final journey. Just before they reached the room, Buddy stopped, turning his head to look back at the waiting area one last time. In that moment, Annie saw flashes of all their visits here, the excited puppy pulling at his leash, the dignified adult dog sitting patiently for his checkups, and now this final version of him, older, slower, but still so full of love. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck, feeling his warm presence and steady heartbeat against her chest. The examination room was different from the ones Annie and Buddy usually visited. Instead of the standard metal table and bright fluorescent lights, this room had soft lighting and a large cushioned mat on the floor. Someone had placed a few battery-operated candles around the room, creating a gentle, comforting atmosphere. The walls, usually covered with medical charts and educational posters, had been decorated with calming nature photographs. Annie helped Buddy settle onto the cushioned mat, making sure his blue blanket was tucked comfortably around him. Her legs felt weak as she sat down beside him on the floor, not caring about keeping her clothes clean anymore. The linoleum floor was cold through her jeans, but she barely noticed. All her attention was focused on Buddy, on memorizing every detail of him in these precious moments. She ran her fingers through his soft fur, finding all the spots she knew by heart. There was the small haul of fur on his chest that always grew in a perfect spiral. The tiny white patch behind his left ear that had earned him his name, it looked just like a cloud on a sunny day. The slight bump on his nose from when he had run into a glass door as a puppy, too excited about seeing another dog outside to notice the barrier. "You've been the best friend anyone could ask for," she whispered, her voice catching. Buddy's tail thumped weakly against the floor in response to her voice, a sound that had been the backdrop to countless moments in their life together. Even now, tired and ill as he was trying to comfort her. Harood's quiet was broken only by their breathing and the soft hum of the air conditioning. Annie found herself telling Buddy stories, reminiscing about their life together. "Remember that time we went camping and you were so excited about the squirrels you pulled the tent down?" She laughed softly through her tears. "Or when you figured out how to open the treat cabinet and ate 3 bags of dog biscuits?" Each memory brought fresh tears, but also waves of gratitude for the time they had shared. She remembered the night her grandmother passed away, how Buddy had somehow known she needed extra comfort and hadn't left her side for days. The time she'd been sick with the flu, and he brought her every toy he owned, one by one, trying to make her feel better. "You've taught me so much," she continued, her fingers gently scratching behind his ears. "How to love unconditionally, how to find joy in simple things, how to be patient." Her voice broke. "How to be brave, even when it hurts." Buddy shifted slightly, resting his head in her lap, as he had done countless times before. His brown eyes, though clouded with age and illness, still held that same soulful look that had captured her heart 12 years ago at the shelter. She remembered that day clearly, how she had only meant to look at dogs, not actually adopt one. But then Buddy had placed his paw on her knee through the kennel bars, and that was it. Love at first sight. The sound of approaching footsteps made Annie's heart clench. She knew it would be Dr. Chen with his medical kit, coming to help Buddy on his final journey. She wasn't ready. How could anyone ever be ready for this? But something unexpected happened when Dr. Chen entered the room. Instead of immediately preparing his equipment, he paused in the doorway, his experienced eyes focusing intently on Buddy. There was something in his expression, a slight frown, a tilt of his head, that seemed different from his usual compassionate demeanor. Buddy had lifted his head slightly at the doctor's entrance, and Annie noticed something too. Despite his weakness, there was a clarity in his eyes that she hadn't seen in weeks. His ears, which had been drooping, had perked up ever so slightly. Dr. Chen moved closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He knelt beside them, but instead of reaching for his medical kit, he began to observe Buddy more carefully. His hands moved gently over the dog's body, checking things Annie couldn't understand, but she could see the growing look of concentration on his face. The room seemed to hold its breath. The soft lighting cast gentle shadows on the walls as Dr. Chen continued his examination. Annie's heart was pounding. Something was happening, something unexpected. She wanted to ask questions, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she held Buddy closer, feeling his warm presence against her, his steady heartbeat beneath her hands. The love that had started 12 years ago felt stronger than ever in this moment, filling the room with an almost tangible force. Time seemed to slow down as Dr. Chen completed his examination. The battery-operated candles flickered softly, creating dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, a bird sang somewhere in the clinic's garden, its cheerful notes filtering through the window. The everyday sounds of the clinic, phones ringing, doors opening and closing, quiet conversations, seemed far away, as if this room existed in its own pocket of time. Annie held her breath as Dr. Chen sat back on his heels, his face showing an expression she hadn't expected to see in this moment. He looked thoughtful, almost puzzled, as if something wasn't quite adding up. His next words would change everything. Words that would turn what seemed like an ending into something entirely different. But for now, in this suspended moment, Annie simply held Buddy close, their hearts beating in sync as they had for 12 beautiful years. The room waited, quiet and expectant, as Dr. Chen prepared to speak. Dr. Chen's words cut through the heavy silence of the room like a shaft of sudden sunlight. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying an urgency that made Annie's heart skip a beat. "This is a mistake." The words hung in the air, almost unreal in their unexpectedness. The doctor's experienced hands moved carefully over Buddy's body again, this time with renewed purpose. Annie watched, barely breathing, as he checked Buddy's gums, felt along his spine, and gently manipulated his joints. Each movement was deliberate, his face showing deep concentration as he pieced together a puzzle only he could see. "Something's not adding up here," Dr. Chen murmured, more to himself than to Annie. He reached for his stethoscope, listening intently to different areas of Buddy's chest and abdomen. The room was so quiet Annie could hear the tick of the wall clock, each second stretching out like an hour. Buddy, who had been lying quietly, showed subtle but noticeable changes. His eyes seemed more alert, following Dr. Chen's movements with interest. When the doctor touched a particular spot on his neck, Buddy's tail gave a stronger thump against the floor than it had in weeks. "Look at this," Dr. Chen said softly, demonstrating something with Buddy's front leg. "The muscle response here isn't what we'd expect with terminal illness." And his lymph nodes, he gently felt under Buddy's jaw. "They're not as swollen as they were last week. In fact, they're almost normal-sized." Annie's hands trembled as she stroked Buddy's fur. "What does that mean?" she asked, afraid to hope but unable to stop herself. The room's soft lighting seemed to hold them in a bubble, the outside world fading away as this unexpected moment unfolded. Dr. Chen sat back on his heels, his face showing the intense concentration of someone rebuilding their understanding of a situation. "Let me check something," he said, standing quickly. "I want to look at his latest blood work again. And I think—" he paused at the door. "I think we need to run a few more specific tests, different ones this time." He hurried out, leaving Annie and Buddy alone in the room. The battery-operated candles continued their gentle flickering, creating a strangely peaceful atmosphere despite the sudden shift in energy. Annie's mind was spinning, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. She looked down at Buddy, who had lifted his head slightly, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. "What's happening, sweet boy?" she whispered, scratching his favorite spot behind his ears. His tail thumped against the floor again, stronger than before. Even his breathing seemed less labored, though Annie wondered if she was imagining it, seeing what she desperately wanted to see. Through the window, she could hear birds singing in the clinic's garden, their cheerful notes seeming more appropriate now than they had just minutes ago. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the plant on the windowsill, bringing with it the faint scent of the flowering bushes outside. Dr. Chen returned quickly, carrying Buddy's medical chart and a tablet. He sat cross-legged on the floor with them, his formal doctor's demeanor replaced by focused enthusiasm. "I've been reviewing everything," he said, scrolling through data on his tablet. "And I think we've been looking at this all wrong. The symptoms we've been seeing, the lethargy, the weakness, the loss of appetite, we attributed them to one thing, but they could be pointing to something else entirely." He showed Annie some numbers on the screen, medical terms she didn't understand but could see were important from the way he pointed them out. "See these values here, and how they compare to last month's. The pattern is different from what we'd expect with our original diagnosis." Annie's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Hope, dangerous and wonderful, began to bloom in her chest. Outside in the hallway, she could hear the muffled sounds of the clinic's normal operations, phones ringing, voices talking, the occasional bark or meow. But in here, time seemed to have shifted into a different dimension. Buddy had managed to sit up slightly, his head more alert than it had been in weeks. He even showed interest in Dr. Chen's pen when it fell from his pocket, his nose twitching in a way that reminded Annie of his younger, healthier days. "I want to run some specific tests right now," Dr. Chen said, getting to his feet. "Tests we haven't done before because we were following a different diagnostic path. Would that be okay?" Annie nodded, unable to speak. The room's atmosphere had completely transformed from the heavy sorrow of minutes ago to something electric with possibility. The same soft lighting that had seemed appropriate for goodbye now felt like it was illuminating hope. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Dr. Chen called out the door. "Could you help me set up for some additional tests?" He turned back to Annie. "This might take a little while. Would you like some water? Coffee? There's no rush now." Now, that simple word carried so much meaning. Because suddenly, incredibly, there was time. Time that minutes ago had seemed to be running out was now stretching out before them, full of possibility. Annie leaned down to hug Buddy, breathing in his familiar scent. His fur was soft against her cheek, his presence solid and real. "We're not saying goodbye yet, are we, boy?" she whispered. His tail thumped against the floor in response, stronger than it had in weeks, as if he understood that something had changed. That hope had entered the room like an unexpected but welcome guest. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. The quiet, somber room that had been prepared for a final goodbye transformed into a hub of purposeful energy. Dr. Chen and his team worked efficiently, running tests that would have seemed impossible just an hour ago when they thought they were at the end of their journey. Annie sat on a chair near the examination table, at hand never leaving Buddy's fur as the veterinary team worked around them. They had moved from the comfort room to a regular exam room, the bright lights now seeming hopeful rather than harsh. Buddy remained calm throughout the procedures, his eyes following Dr. Chen's movements with increasing alertness. "His blood pressure is significantly better than last week," commented the veterinary technician, a note of surprise in her voice as she checked the readings. Dr. Chen nodded, making notes on his tablet while examining the results of each new test. The morning sun streamed through the window, catching dust motes in its beams and making them dance like tiny stars. Annie watched as Dr. Chen studied slides under a microscope, his face showing the deep concentration of someone putting together pieces of a complex puzzle. Every few minutes, he would make a soft sound that made Annie's heart skip. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with cups of hot tea for everyone, the warmth and familiar smell helping to ground Annie in this surreal moment. "You know," the receptionist said softly, "I've seen miracles happen in this clinic before. Sometimes we just need to look at things from a different angle." Dr. Chen finally pulled up a stool, his face showing the satisfaction of someone who has solved a particularly challenging problem. "I think I understand what's happening now," he began, his voice carrying both professional authority and genuine relief. "Buddy has two separate conditions that have been masking each other, making us think we were dealing with something much more serious." He pulled up some diagrams on his tablet, turning it so Annie could see. "First, he has hypothyroidism. His thyroid gland isn't producing enough hormones. This can cause lethargy, weakness, and depression-like symptoms. We missed it initially because the symptoms overlapped with what we thought was," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "a more serious condition." Annie's fingers curled gently in Buddy's fur as she listened. The old dog had perked up noticeably in the past hour, as if the very act of being examined had awakened something in him. His tail would thump against the table whenever someone spoke directly to him. "But that's not all," Dr. Chen continued, scrolling through more test results. "He also has a severe vitamin B12 deficiency. This is actually quite common in older dogs, but when combined with the hypothyroidism, it created a perfect storm of symptoms that mimicked something much more sinister." He showed Annie a comparison of blood test results, pointing out the differences between today's readings and those from last week. Though the medical terminology was complex, the hope in his voice made everything clear. "The good news," he said, a smile breaking across his face, "is that both conditions are completely treatable." The word treatable hung in the air like a burst of sunshine after a storm. Annie felt tears rolling down her cheeks again, but these were entirely different from the ones she'd been crying all morning. Buddy, seeming to sense the change in mood, lifted his head and gave her hand a gentle lick. "We'll start him on thyroid medication right away," Dr. Chen explained, reaching for his prescription pad. "It's a simple pill that you'll give him twice daily. The B12 deficiency we can address with injections. We'll do the first one today and then set up a regular schedule." The veterinary technician was already preparing the first injection, her movements efficient but gentle. "You might start seeing improvements within a few days," she added encouragingly, "though it could take a few weeks for him to feel completely better." As they waited for the pharmacy to prepare Buddy's medications, Annie noticed more positive changes. His breathing seemed easier, and his eyes had lost that dull, pained look. Whether it was the relief of not going through with the originally planned procedure or just the natural result of being more thoroughly examined, Buddy seemed more present than he had in weeks. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared again, this time with a small bag of Buddy's favorite treats, the ones he had stopped eating weeks ago. To everyone's delight, he gently took one from her hand, chewing slowly but with obvious enjoyment. The simple act brought fresh tears to Annie's eyes. "Now," Dr. Chen said, returning with a bag of medications and detailed instructions, "we'll need to monitor him closely over the next few weeks. I want to see him twice a week initially to check his blood levels and adjust the medication as needed. But," he added with a warm smile, "I think we're going to see a very different dog very soon." The sunlight had shifted in the room, creating a warm patch on the examination table. Buddy, showing more energy than he had in weeks, actually moved himself to lie in it, a small act that seemed enormous in its significance. His tail continued its gentle thumping against the table, each beat like a drum of hope. Annie listened carefully as Dr. Chen explained the treatment plan, taking notes on her phone. The medical terms that had seemed so frightening before now felt like keys unlocking a future she thought she'd lost. Words like prognosis and treatment protocol had transformed from harbingers of sorrow to promises of hope. Outside the examination room, they could hear the normal sounds of the clinic, the phone ringing, other pets arriving for their appointments, the gentle chatter of staff going about their daily routines. These ordinary sounds now seemed extraordinary, a reminder that they would be part of this normal rhythm of life for many more days to come. The transformation over the next few months was nothing short of remarkable. Each day brought small victories that added up to an incredible journey of recovery. Annie kept a diary on her phone, documenting every tiny sign of improvement in Buddy's condition, each moment feeling like a gift she never expected to receive. The first week was filled with careful optimism. Buddy started showing interest in his food again, beginning with small portions but gradually returning to his normal appetite. His favorite duck-flavored treats, which had sat untouched for weeks, suddenly became treasured again. Annie found herself crying happy tears the first time he trotted to his food bowl without having to be coaxed. Dr. Chen's predicted timeline proved accurate. By the end of the second week, Buddy's energy levels had noticeably improved. The thyroid medication and B12 injections were working their magic, bringing back the dog Annie had known and loved for so many years. The morning walks, which had become painful struggles, transformed back into enjoyable adventures, even if they were shorter than in his younger days. One particularly memorable morning, about 3 weeks into treatment, Buddy surprised everyone by picking up his favorite tennis ball, something he hadn't done in months. He didn't have the energy to play fetch like he used to, but just seeing him carry the ball around the house made Annie's heart soar. She sent a video to Dr. Chen, who shared it with the entire clinic staff. Mrs. Rodriguez later told her there wasn't a dry eye in the building when they watched it. The twice-weekly checkups became a source of joy rather than dread. Each visit showed improvement in Buddy's blood work, and the staff celebrated every positive change. The veterinary technicians kept a chart of his progress, decorating it with paw print stickers every time he reached a new milestone. Buddy would walk into the clinic with his tail wagging, no longer showing the fear and reluctance that had marked his visits during his illness. By the end of the second month, the change was dramatic. Buddy's fur, which had become dull and lifeless, regained its golden shine. His eyes sparkled with renewed interest in the world around him. He started greeting the mail carrier again, something he had done religiously before his illness. The first time he barked at a squirrel in the backyard, Annie called her mom in tears of joy. The daily medication routine became a simple part of their life together. Buddy seemed to understand that the pills helped him feel better, taking them without complaint, wrapped in small pieces of cheese. The B12 injections, though less frequent now, were handled with patience, as if he knew they were part of his journey back to health. 6 months after that fateful day at the clinic, Buddy had reclaimed most of his old routines. He still needed more rest than before, and some days were better than others, but the dog who had nearly been lost was very much present and full of life. His favorite spot by the living room window became his command post once again, where he would watch the neighborhood activities with keen interest. The garden became a place of joy once more. Buddy would spend hours lying in the sun, occasionally getting up to investigate an interesting smell or chase a butterfly. The flowers that had nearly witnessed their final goodbye now watched him roll in the grass, his happiness evident in every movement. Annie started a social media account documenting Buddy's recovery, sharing their story to give hope to other pet owners facing similar situations. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people around the world, sharing their own stories of hope and healing. Dr. Chen even asked permission to use Buddy's case in a veterinary journal, highlighting the importance of thorough diagnosis and the possibility of hope even in seemingly hopeless situations. 1 year after the day they thought would be their last, Annie and Buddy returned to the clinic for a checkup. The comfort room where they had nearly said goodbye had been renovated into a recovery room, painted in cheerful colors and decorated with success stories. Buddy's photo held a place of honor on the wall. Mrs. Rodriguez greeted them with treats and happy tears, remembering that terrible morning that had turned into such a miracle. The veterinary technicians took turns hugging Buddy, marveling at his continued recovery. Dr. Chen performed the checkup with his usual thoroughness, but now his face showed only satisfaction at how well his patient was doing. "You know," Dr. Chen said as they were leaving, "cases like Buddy's remind us why we became veterinarians. Sometimes hope comes disguised as a mistake, and miracles happen when we least expect them." On their way out, they passed through the clinic's garden, the same garden where they had taken what they thought would be their final walk together. Now it was just another pleasant stop on their regular visits. Buddy paused to sniff the flowers, his tail wagging happily in the sunshine. Annie watched him, a heart full of gratitude for this second chance, this gift of time she never expected to have. As they drove home, Buddy sat in his usual spot in the backseat, his head lifted to catch the breeze from the slightly opened window. His favorite blue blanket was still there, but now it was just a comfort rather than a final comfort. In the rearview mirror, Annie could see his eyes bright and alert, full of life and love. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, something that had become their new daily ritual, Annie reflected on how close they had come to missing all of this. Buddy lay beside her chair, occasionally lifting his head to watch birds or follow the sounds of children playing in the distance. His presence was a constant reminder that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures, and that hope, even when it seems lost, has a way of finding its way back home.